How should we adapt America's healthcare to meet modern standards? Hi, my name is Mark Latif, and I would like to present my ideas with this topic. Before we get into it, I would like to present a brief table of contents. I'm going to first go over how we know America's healthcare is inefficient, then move on to specific issues with the healthcare system, then talk about solutions to these issues, and lastly talk about limitations and implications. How does this relate to the stimuli? Well, in the stimulus, there are three main themes: community, adaptation, and adversity. In their own words, is a great example of this, because I saw a group of Haitians coming together as a community to defeat some adversity, which was the 2010 earthquake. They had to defeat this adversity through adapting their own means of survival so that they could get the best outcome. I instantly thought of how America could adapt to get a better outcome for its people, and one of the biggest issues is healthcare. How do we know America's healthcare is inefficient? Medical efficiency is often regarded in the common literature as medical effectiveness compared to financial burden. Medical effectiveness often means like life expectancy and infant mortality rates and other statistics in that nature, whereas financial burden is percent of GDP and how much total dollars is spent on the healthcare system. In the US, there are 5.4 infant mortalities per 1,000 births, and 77.3 years for men is the life expectancy, and 82.2 years for females are the life expectancy. There are 530,000 families that go bankrupt every year due to medical expenses. We spend $4.3 trillion on the healthcare system. That is around the same GDP as Germany. Germany has an infant mortality rate of 2.1 mortalities per 1,000 births and a life expectancy on average 2 years higher than America's. It may not be the best or the most effective system, but the government effectively utilizes their resources to get the best results for their citizens. They have virtually zero people going bankrupt because of medical expenses every year. In fact, Germany uses a smaller percent of their GDP. They have a GDP 6 times smaller than America's, but they have a population only 4 times smaller. So they have more people per GDP, and they still use less percent of their GDP for healthcare. So this really shows us that we can become more efficient as a medical system. This graph over here shows in 2004 how America spends over 2 times the peer countries, which is Canada, France, Germany, UK, Switzerland, and Japan. We spend nearly twice as much as those countries in per capita healthcare spending. This just goes to show how these countries have more effective healthcares, but we somehow spend more money. Next, let's talk about specific issues with America's healthcare. Insurance. There are 3 main issues: insurances, drug companies, and lack of regulation. With insurances, deductible prices are too high. Deductibles are how much you have to pay out of pocket before the insurance steps in and helps you out with medical costs. With drug companies, they upmarket their products as much because they have both a monopoly on the market as well as a monopoly on the person's life. And for lack of regulation, there are not enough laws regarding how hospitals have to bill in order to put it on the insurance. The average premiums and deductibles in each state is baffling. In Georgia alone, this is one of the more moderate states. We have $8,500 in average deductibles for employer benefit healthcare. This means that if you have to pay $10,000 in medical expenses, if you had a $10,000 bill for medical expenses, you would have to pay $8,500 before your insurance, whom you pay, steps in. In Texas, it's even worse. The average is $9,300, which is baffling because that means that the people that you pay to cover this financial burden only cover $700 of a $10,000 bill. Next, let's talk about medical manufacturing. These 3 companies, Novo Nordisk, Eli Lilly, and Sanofi Aventis, control over 90% of the insulin market. That means that they have both a monopoly on the market as well as the person, because most insulin-dependent people have to buy from one of these 3 companies, meaning that they become more lucrative and more profitable as time goes on. This graph was created in 2011, and now Eli Lilly is more superior, and there's an even larger monopoly on the market. Lastly, next let's talk about solutions. There are 3 main solutions that I thought. We could either A, abolish insurance companies, or B, implement reforms for insurance companies and medical manufacturers, and C, reform and popularize public hospitals. If we abolish insurance companies, that would get rid of the strain on the individual person. However, it will not get rid of the strain on the government. This will do nothing but increase how much we have to pay in our healthcare system by expanding platforms like Medicare and Medicaid. If we implement reforms for insurance companies and medical manufacturers, this could be good. However, America has a very unfriendly relationship with socialism, and many see this option as a form of socialism, so it may not fly. Lastly, we could reform and popularize public hospitals. This is probably the most promising out of the three. However, it still has its issues because we would have to raise taxes so much that we could create enough public hospitals for this plan to be efficient. My solution: I plan to combine the reforms and popularizing public hospitals with reforming medical manufacturers. If we get the proper legislation passed, which is to create government-ran medical manufacturers as well as create government-ran hospitals, we could potentially compete with the market enough so that we could have control over, more control over the monopolies. In phase one, after we do all the lobbying and get the bills passed, we would move on to phase two, which would create more competition with the medical companies like Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly. After that, we would create government-ran hospitals that use these cheaper drugs that are not upmarked as much as the Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly's, and we would have cheaper hospitals, or we would essentially have cheaper hospitals. After this, we would create incentives for medical professionals to work at the new facilities. We would do this by using the same techniques that the military uses, by creating, by soliciting benefits in med schools where doctors are made. Next, let's talk about limitations and implications. First off, why so late? We have proponents arguing for healthcare reforms such as AOC and Bernie Sanders. Both, however, are considered socialist. Americans do not like socialism. We fought an entire Cold War over this ideology. Next, let's talk about implications. Next, let's talk about implications. One implication is that we would potentially have to raise taxes temporarily so that we could create the medical manufacturing plants, and this would make Americans unhappy. This will also this would also become sort of risky, as we cannot tell what such a volatile market is going to do. So the competition may or may not work. However, with the full plan, I believe that this will work. Thank you.
Mark, how did your research question evolve as you moved through the research process?
So originally it was just, if we go back to the first. Originally it was just, Originally it was just how should we change America's healthcare to become better? That we were not comparing it to anyone. But after thorough research, I realized that's not gonna fly. So we have to compare it to something. And then I remember that we needed to bring the stimulus into the argument, so I had to fit in how do we adapt America. And I believe that this is one of the better ways to adapt.
And what additional questions emerged from your research, and why are these questions important?
So, in the end, I talked about how Americans don't like AOC or some Americans don't like AOC or Bernie Sanders because they're viewed as socialists, and this made me question, why don't Americans like socialism? This led me on a long rabbit hole, and essentially it's just an ideological difference. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
No problem.